Hi, everyone, and thank you so much for joining us for this webinar today. We are partnering with Edelman to talk about the 2023 Edelman Trust Barometer. My name is Tina McCorkindale, and I'm the President and CEO of the Institute for Public Relations. So before we begin, I just have a few reminders for you. I know you've all heard this before, but we do have a lot of people that are going to join the call. If you have any logistical questions or technological difficulties during today's session, feel free to send a message to any one of us at IPR. We also have a really large group today, so if you have questions, try to share them in the Q&A piece and not the chat, because it's much easier to monitor the Q&A. But we do encourage you to use the chat to share resources and whatever you think of what the panelists say or whatever the presenters say. So we are also recording the session, and it will be added to the IPR YouTube channel so you can view it and refer to it after the event. And it usually takes us a couple of days to put it online, but it will be there very soon. So today I'm so excited to introduce Margot Edelman. She's one of our new IPR trustees. She is the Deputy General Manager of Edelman's New York office, the largest in the Edelman network. Previously, she was the General Manager of Edelman's Bay Area hub, which spans 170 professionals in San Francisco. So Margot first is going to discuss the findings of the Edelman Trust Barometer, and then we're going to turn it over to our moderator to lead a panel discussion. Our moderator today is Eleanor Hawkins. She's a communications strategist and writer at Axios, where she authors the weekly Axios Communicators newsletter. It's really good. You should subscribe, and covers topics and trends that impact how leaders, brands, and employers communicate. So I'd also like to introduce our featured panelists, who are all some of our amazing IPR trustees. First, we have Ariel Patrick, the Chief Communications, I just have to say that right, Arielle Patrick, the Chief Communications Officer for Ariel Investments, where she leads an integrated team that handles all communications for the firm and its private equity subsidiary, Ariel Alternatives. Next, we welcome Oscar Suris. He is President of Edelman's New York office, who has 20 years of experience providing strategic public relations leadership to Fortune 100 companies and 10 years of experience with national and local news organizations. And last but not least, we're happy to have Trity Pourbahrami, who is the Communications Officer of Science Programs for the Gordon and Betty Moore Foundation. In her role, she focuses on the advancement of emerging scientific fields through developing new technologies, supporting imaginative research scientists, and creating new collaborations at the frontiers of traditional scientific disciplines. So thank you all for being part of this webinar, and to Edelman for their partnership. And with that, I will hand the floor over to Margot to start our webinar. Margot.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Tina, and thank you to the whole IPR team for having us on today. Very excited to share the findings of the 2023 Trust Barometer with this group, and then hear from our panelists, who I know will have a great discussion along with Eleanor as well from Axios. So give me 1 second while I share my screen. I promise I know how to do this. I checked before and it works. Hold on. Can everybody see this one? Okay, good. All right, so we're going to take you through the findings of the 2023 Edelman Trust Barometer. So before I get into the findings, I want to take you through a little bit of the methodology behind the Trust Barometer. So this is an annual survey we do of media, business, government, and NGOs around the world. We look at trust in each of these 4 key institutions. The survey this year is in its 23rd year. So we have significant longitudinal data around trust. And we did this survey in 28 countries with really 32,000 respondents around the world. We really try to get sort of a representative sample all the way from Latin America to the United States to Asia to Europe. So really get a broad swath of countries that participate in the survey. So found this year is the key theme is that polarization. And we found sort of 4 forces really leading to polarization around the world. First is economic anxiety. What we found is that economic optimism is collapsing around the world. In 24 of the 28 countries that we surveyed, we found all-time lows in respondents saying that their families are going to be better off 5 years from now than they are today. People don't necessarily think their future is going to be better than the present. Second, there's an institutional imbalance. Today, business is the only institution that's viewed as competent and ethical. Government is viewed as unethical and incompetent. which is not good. And what we can see is that business is really under pressure to step into this void left by government. And we'll get into some examples later of what government was doing and that business is sort of now expected to step into. Next is the mass class divide. So we can see that people who are living in the top quartile of income in their respective countries live in a very different trust reality than people who live in the bottom quartile. If you're in the top quartile, life is good. You trust institutions. The world is working for you. When you don't, you really view the world as not necessarily working for you, and you stop trusting those same institutions. And then lastly is the battle for the truth. We can really see that media has given way to echo chambers, has become more polarized. And we also see that people don't trust the media, and this is particularly because there is a significant amount of distrust in social media. That's what's really driving the distrust in media and the fear of misinformation. So let's start here with the sort of economic optimism and what we see from the data. So what we found is that economic optimism this year truly, what we found has collapsed. So particularly if you look in the developed world, the UK, Germany, Italy, France, what we found is when we asked people, is your family going to be better off 5 years from now than today? What we found is that the majority don't think that. And in fact, it significantly dropped from last year to this year in terms of the numbers. And it's really much more in the developing world, India, Indonesia, Kenya, where we do think that people see the world better 5 years from now than they are today, although those numbers have dropped as well from last year. Business is the only trusted institution. So if you look at sort of business, NGOs, government, and media, business stands at 62 points globally. Media is the lowest at 50 points, it's dropped by a point. And again, what we see is the least trusting institutions, least trusting countries for these institutions typically are in the developed world. They're the UK, Japan, South Korea, but it's the developed world that's not trusting of institutions. And we can see that government and media are really seen as fueling this cycle of distrust. So when we actually looked at whether these institutions are a source of false or misleading information or a reliable source of information, what we found here is the business is actually seen as a reliable source of information, interestingly. Media is split. Government is seen as a false source of information, and NGOs are also seen as a trusted source of information. So as we can see here, governments are really not necessarily trusted in order to provide sort of trustworthy information. And what we also see is that personal anxieties are what we call on par with existential fears. So these are things like job loss, inflation, which impact people personally. People actually fear these more, just as much or more as things like climate change, food shortages, energy shortages. And, again, going back to the job loss one, perhaps, not surprisingly, we actually collected this data in the fall. It was right before a number of companies, at least in the United States, actually ended up sort of doing layoffs. So perhaps some of these fears were actually founded in truth. We also found that institutional leaders are distrusted, and this is particularly true, and those on the call take note, this is particularly true for CEOs, for journalists, for government leaders. However, things like my CEO, for example, or my neighbors or my coworkers are trusted. So as we can see, trust is local, and trust is within my institution that I belong to, whether it's my community or whether it's my employer. And I think, again, this is particularly relevant the communications people on the call, because this is something we will need to think about as we're communicating on behalf of our clients. This data here really illustrates the mass class divide, how there's really an inequality is really fueling distrust of institutions. So if you look in the top quartile, which is over here on the left, you can see that the vast majority of people in the top quartile of countries trust institutions. However, when you look at the bottom quartile, the number flips and the vast majority don't trust institutions. So you can really see here it's income inequality that is driving distrust. I find this slide really, really interesting, and it's that trust at home doesn't guarantee trust abroad. So what we can see here is that people trust companies that are headquartered in their own markets. So for example, if you look at the United States, 65% trust companies headquartered in the US. For France, that number is 59%. And then when you start looking at the gap between trust in domestic companies versus trust in foreign companies, that's where it starts to fall. So for example, in the United States, foreign trust goes to 55 versus 65. For example, if you start looking at places like India and China, foreign trust in China and India stand at 34 points and 32 points respectively, whereas domestic trust in companies headquartered in those markets stand at 90 and 89. So there really is a trust deficit specifically in China and India, but overall people trust companies headquartered in their own markets, not necessarily ones that are abroad. So now let's talk a little bit more about polarization. So what we can see here is that the drivers of polarization are distrust, a weak social fabric, and a feeling of unfairness and economic pessimism. So polarization is a cycle, and it leads to further distrust. So when people say their country is not very divided, they tend to trust. They trust business, they trust NGOs, they trust the government. When they say it's divided but not entrenched, they still trust business and NGOs. And when they start to see countries as significantly polarized, then they stop trusting. Even business becomes neutral and they stop trusting NGOs, media, and the government. So polarization is leading to further distrust in institutions. And we can see people today believe that we are more divided than in the past. The majority, 15 of 26 countries agree that our country is more divided today than it was in the past. And the average here is 53%. But if you look here again, it's really that developed world where we can really see sort of polarization and being divided starting to take hold. We can also see the weakening of the social fabric. Again, we asked, the lack of civility and mutual respect today is the worst I've ever seen. 65% agreed. And then when we said the social fabric that once held this country together has grown too weak to serve as a foundation for unity and common purpose, 62% agreed. So again, we can see the social feelings of weakening of the social fabric. And then now let's look at sort of greater expectations there's greater expectations, but also heightened risk for business. So as we see here, again, third year in a row, only business is seen as competent and ethical. And frankly, there's been a rise in ethics for business. People's employers are most trusted. If you look at the numbers for business, NGOs, government, and media, they are in the 50s to low 60s. When people ask about trust in my employer, it stands at 77%. That's a huge advantage. So for those of you on the call who are working with a company's employees on communications, your employees can be a huge advantage for you as you think about communications campaigns and as you think about building trust. And then among those who feel polarized, my employer is really the only trusted institution. So again, it's 81 points among those not very divided. Among those who say polarized divisions are entrenched, they still trust their employer, even though they don't trust other institutions. So again, employees can be your key advocates and your key partners as you're communicating about your employers and your clients. And my employer is also trusted in the US. I know the majority of us are based in the United States, so just wanted to give a flag on what that looked like in the US. So 76% trust my employer, and these numbers are much lower for business, media, and government, and NGOs overall. So again, employees, big trust advantage there. Consumers and employees are also pressuring business to stand up for them. So we found, actually we did a special report on trust in the workplace and influence. And what we found is that 63% said they're going to buy or advocate for brands based on their beliefs and values. And also they say having a societal impact is a strong expectation or deal breaker when considering a job. So it actually is influencing whether people are buying or advocating for brands and whether people are taking jobs. So again, you can really see why, having trust and having values that are consistent with your customers or your employees are so important. Again, this is the numbers for the United States. And people want more societal engagement from business, not less. So we can see here, we asked, on addressing each societal issue, is business not doing enough or are they overstepping? And what they found consistently is on key areas like climate change, economic inequality, energy shortage, healthcare access, trustworthy information, and workforce reskilling, the vast majority believe that business is not actually doing enough versus overstepping. So again, these are key areas where your clients or where your employers have an opportunity to lead. Because again, people want to see more from business. This is what they want and what they expect. And again, these are the numbers in the United States, so a little bit less than global, but it still very much holds in the US. So navigating a polarized world. what are the expectations of CEOs in today's world? Well, we actually found that CEOs are expected to take action on employees, on climate, and on areas like discrimination. So the vast majority actually said people expect CEOs to take a public stand on areas like treatment of employees, climate change, discrimination, wealth gap, and immigration. Treatment of employees and climate change, the numbers are really high. So again, these are key areas where your clients could have an opportunity to lead if they aren't already. And people also want CEOs in a lot of ways to sort of hold what we call divisive forces accountable. So they believe that CEOs are obligated to defend facts and to expose questionable science. They want them to pull, this is interesting, they want them to pull advertising money from platforms that spread misinformation. And they also believe that companies can actually strengthen the social fabric if they support politicians and media that build consensus. And again, these are the US numbers. You can see they very much track to the global numbers as well. And then finally, trustworthy information actually insulates business action from politicization. So for those of you who are saying, oh no, climate change, it's seen as, part of the left and it's too liberal. But what our response would be is that in order to act without being seen as politicized, it's really important to sort of align with what facts are and with trustworthy information. So again, what we found here, some ways to act, again, without being sort of aligned with one party or another, are be a trustworthy information source, base your actions on science. This maybe seems obvious, but don't align with only one political party, act on the same values over time, and link actions to staying competitive. So these are all the things you can do to act and then not sort of be seen as sort of a, at least in the United States, a tool of the left or the right. And then, again, people really want companies and CEOs to help improve economic optimism. So people say that CEOs are obligated to pay a fair wage, ensure their home community is safe and thriving, to pay fair corporate taxes, and to retrain employees. So again, these are all areas where business has the license to lead and the license to step up. And it's not, again, a nice to have. These are things that, again, they're seen as increasingly, perhaps not table stakes, but really things that it can increase trust in a company. And they also want to use the power of brands to create a shared identity. So in a lot of ways, what people say is that they believe that brands celebrating what brings us together and emphasizing our common interests would actually strengthen the social fabric. So in a lot of ways, brands actually do have the ability to make a change, to bring people together, to sort of help counteract a lot of the factors of polarization in today's world. So finally, I just wanted to give sort of a key takeaways based on the data we just heard. So first, it's just that business needs to continue to lead. Business holds the mantle of greater expectation and responsibility. And you can use your advantage in areas like climate change, diversity, retraining your workers, paying a fair wage. These are all things that business really has the license to lead on. Secondly, is to collaborate with government. What we found is that the best results come when business and government work together and not independently. So it's important to really build consensus, to align with government, with politicians, also particularly partner with NGOs as well. It's really all about partnerships, not about going it alone. And that's what allows business, again, to have sort of the credibility to lead. Finally, it's important to restore economic optimism. So again, we can see that a grim economic view has been a driver and an outcome for polarization. So we believe it's important for companies and CEOs to invest in fair compensation, training, invest in your local communities, again, as a way to sort of address that mass class divide. And then finally, it's to advocate for the truth. We saw here that my employer is the most trusted institution, and my CEO is more trusted than a journalist, than a different CEO. And so it's really up to companies to advocate for the truth. So providing trustworthy information, leaning on science, all of these areas are ways for your actions to be taken not as politicized, but actually truly as investing in bettering the communities in which you operate. So we'll just end here with the top 10 takeaways, which again, we've gone through extensively. But anyways, with that, just want to wrap up and turn it over to Eleanor and our panelists to have a discussion about what we found and really how to sort of provide sort of the greater context around how some of this data can work in practice.
Thank you, Margot. I want to start just broadly, Oscar. I'm going to start with you. I think business leaders would be surprised and maybe a little relieved to know that they are the most trusted institution. So now that business leaders have this trust, now that brands have this trust, how can they make the most of it?
I think first and foremost by acting on their promises and commitments to their stakeholders. It's wonderful that we've seen, I think increasingly more and more CEOs and companies go on record on a whole host of issues of importance in our society. But the public is also very savvy, and they also recognize when there's a significant gap between a corporation's deeds and their words. And so I think the smartest CEOs understand this, and they're backed up by senior leadership teams who can appreciate this as well. And they're becoming ever more, I think, mindful of when they're putting statements out there or pledges or words or promises, that they're backing them up with actions too.
I've also talked with you, Arielle, about the business imperative of these efforts. And I know it's something that you've thought through at your time at Ariel Investments. So can you talk to us a little bit about why taking a stand or why being so public facing on societal issues is a business imperative, and how does it maintain trust?
Sure. First, I wanted to thank you all for having me. I'll say my first reaction to the data is that I'm not surprised that corporate leaders are viewed as the most trusted, because when you think about the reckoning after the murder of George Floyd, this was the first time when all the legal systems were purportedly in place, and it was really up to the number one employers of the country, as well as the number one supply chain partners of the country, to actually act. So, we call it civil rights 3.0. 1.0 was the Emancipation Proclamation, 2.0 was the Civil Rights Act and the Voting Rights Act in the 60s, and now 3.0 is where we find ourselves today, where really the onus of the societal issues that we're facing is at the feet of corporate America. We are the ones that are in a position to create equality for people who are looking to secure financial security for their families. We are the ones that can fund and create economic opportunity for minority-owned businesses. And we are the ones that are expected to have a reaction to any and everything that happens. I will caveat that, though, by saying that empty statements, we all know this, we're communicators, empty statements mean nothing. And one of the litmus tests that I put my team through at Ariel is, before we decide to post anything or send something out, do we have something to add? We don't always. I think that people actually assume, because we're the first Black-owned asset management firm in the US, that we are somehow meant to cleanse every wrongdoing, or meant to have a point of view about everything that's going on in the world. And there are many cases where we don't. For example, I remember it was Indigenous Peoples Day, and the team said, "Oh, we're preparing this post." And I said, "Well, what are we saying? Are we just saying Happy Indigenous Peoples Day? That's really empty." And where we landed was, we actually decided to direct our followers to other institutions that we felt had resources, expertise, and really tangible resources on how to be allies and be activists in the space. And so I think there's no shame, especially if you're a communications leader, in encouraging your team to really focus on directing your stakeholder audiences to people who know more than you. That's your responsibility, is to share knowledge. It's not your responsibility to virtue signal and say, "Oh, we posted, we checked the box." No one's really looking for that. And this new generation has really shown us that we are always being scrutinized, and phony statements are very easily sniffed out these days.
The report also shows, though, that, in polarized nations, which I would argue in the US we count as that, businesses face more risk for speaking out and for wading in. So maybe Oscar or Margot, how do you advise those clients who are like, I don't feel comfortable, this isn't my job? What approach do you take with them? And then what advice do you have for communicators who might be struggling with that same issue? If they know that they need to speak out, they know that they need to do something, but they don't have the buy-in from the top.
Well, I think it starts with being anchored in a company's purpose and its cultural values, and having clarity around those two things are fundamental to, I think, sorting through those sorts of questions. And I think Ariel said it great. What are you contributing to the issue or the cause or the conversation, and are you seen as a credible participant entering into it, right? So I think for communicators who are trying to navigate these things, I would start there as a foundational premise for helping internal clients try to figure out, is this the right issue or topic to be investing our capital in? Margot, I don't know if you'd build on that.
Yeah, I completely agree. So, for example, when the ruling around Roe v. Wade fell, one of the things that we counseled our clients was start with your own employees. Talk about what you're going to at least start, within your own employee base. Talk about what you're going to do for the women around the country. What are the medical benefits you're going to continue to offer? What are you going to do for them? So again, it's sort of going back to sort of trust is local. Trust stands with your employer. I think, at the very least, starting what you're going to do for your employees around an issue is that's table stakes for how to approach something and talk about something. And then beyond that, I think, going back to what Oscar said, it needs to relate, and Ariel said, it needs to relate back to the company's sort of core purpose and core mission. So if you're in the technology industry and, you're, part of what your technology does is automate jobs, you need to then sort of invest in reskilling and retraining workers. And that's very credible because it very much aligns with what your business does. And so again, just really making sure that you're not sort of, coming out of left field with something, but that it really aligns with your business mission and business goals and values.
I'm really glad you brought up the employee aspect of decision making and how they are really a key audience, if not the prized audience now. And Trity, I want to get you in on this conversation because I know you have a unique role in that your CEO is also a scientist, and you speak with more academic and policy focused employee base. So how do you think about that as not only being a trusted CEO, but also being a trusted source of information as an academic?
Great. Thank you so much, Eleanor, and it's wonderful to be with everybody. Let me give an example. When the pandemic started, we were fortunate enough at the Gordon and Betty Moore Foundation to have our president be a physician and also an expert in infectious diseases. So what we decided to do was, for our regular Tuesday stand-up meetings, our president would stand up and speak to the whole employee base with the information that he knew was coming out regarding the pandemic and COVID-19. This occurred from March 2020 all the way to today, right? And our offices didn't fully open until January of 2023. This action by my CEO, by our president, to stand up and answer any questions that the employees had, and he even offered his personal cell phone number if you needed to call and ask a question about your relative who's sick or ask a question about the vaccine. This built so much trust in our employee base, and this brought our organization together in the middle of one of the biggest crises ever. So I feel like that's how we can show up for our employees. That's how that trust that we have in our CEOs can be built. And as a communicator, I was delighted to see him be honest and open with the science as it was evolving through this whole time.
Yes, but not every CEO is a physician, does have that background as a scientist. So, and the report also shows, as Margot pointed out, that CEOs are expected to combat and question science that might not be totally rooted in fact, right? So, Trity, is there anything that your organization is doing to help educate business leaders or policymakers? Can you talk to us about how you're kind of bridging the gap there?
Sure, I can talk specifically about what I'm doing. I've been teaching scientists and engineers for a long time on how to be more effective communicators. And the way to do that is As a scientist myself, we're very comfortable with uncertainty, but the general public is not. And when a scientist doesn't know how to clearly communicate uncertainty, it degrades trust and there's suspicion that's introduced, right? So it's training scientists to start with consensus science, what we know for sure, walking your audience through step by step of what is known and how the science is evolving. I use the analogy of holding the hand of your audience, not talking down to them or not talking in a way that makes them feel less intelligent, right? So it starts with that. It starts with really training the individuals who have chosen to be in science and technology to better communicate their approach and their approach to science. Does that help?
That's helpful. I think along with science, one thing that we're seeing that's very, very uncertain is the economy. And Margot, you pointed out, the economic optimism is collapsing even in developed countries. Arielle, maybe as our resident financial communicator, you could jump in and talk about what you're seeing when it comes to economic optimism, maybe how your leadership, how your firm is communicating during these uncertain times, and how you can continue to garner trust, even though nobody seems to really know what's happening, what's coming next, and everybody's a little on edge with job security and the likes.
Sure. I think the one thing that we try to make sure that people understand is that the market is cyclical. And so when people say they don't know what's next, we actually have history to point to. And I think often that is lost on people, which is that, for example, if we look at the crypto crash, many people during a survey that we developed claimed that they thought crypto was a safer bet than the stock market. It's still crazy to me that a new investor would think that something with zero track record is somehow more trustworthy than something that has decades and decades of a track record. So I think what we try to do is just point to history the most, point to moments in time where we've seen resilience or bounces back. But we also don't try to minimize concerns, right? People are scared. People have issues that they are facing day to day that are very real. And so one of the things that we try to emphasize the most is humility. So you may have seen a op-ed that Melody and John, our co-CEOs, wrote that I supported in the Wall Street Journal. And one of the subheaders in the article was, everyone thinks they know, but nobody knows. And we wanted to say that because even though we're being tasked with writing this op-ed and we're meant to be seen as experts, we do not want to pretend to know all the answers. And so I think as communicators, we have to be as forthright about what we absolutely do not know and cannot predict, at the same time as pointing to the information that we do have. I know that that's pretty abstract and not as promissory as you were expecting, but that's really all we've got at this point.
That's really helpful. And I think one of the things that you pointed to is just being transparent and having candor in your messaging. I think that's something we're seeing more and more of, especially when it comes to internal communications. But the report also shows that there is this divide and this division within trust, especially when it comes to different income levels. And often we see that, kind of translate in the workplace too, right? Senior leadership is totally bought in. So Oscar, I see that you're nodding enthusiastically. Talk to me about your thoughts there, and how do you get everybody in the company on board?
Well, I think it's cultivating an awareness and to an extent an empathy for the fact that not everybody is experiencing the economy in the same way these days, right? And that continues. I mean, you saw it right in the immediate wake of the pandemic. There were economic winners and there were economic losers, and in some ways, in very striking ways, in certain categories of the global economy, and that has continued on into today's economy, which, depending on who you speak to, is on its way to a clear recession, or now some people are talking about a no landing economy where we may not have a hard landing or a soft landing. We may just enjoy this period of, pretty steady growth, and yet against a backdrop of an inflationary environment. But yet, consumer spending strong, sentiment has been on an uptick, and but it's not universally experienced because people still deal with things like student loan debt, and there's a lot of people who have fallen out of the labor market, and so on. So I think, the key is meeting your stakeholders where they are and recognizing that they're not monolithic in how they're experiencing the world.
So meeting your stakeholders where they are is a great kind of segue into the next topic that I want to talk about, which is businesses as the most trusted source of information. I read somewhere that the internal newsletter is the most trusted news source out there. So I'd be curious to hear from any of you who want to jump in just about the importance of internal comms and maybe the uptick that you've seen in owned content. Arielle, you mentioned an op-ed that you all placed, but how are you all thinking about owned content and messaging not only to your employees, but to the broader, the various stakeholders without going through the media?
Well, I think, and I say this as an Edelman alum, one of the things that we're always told and that we preach to clients, when I was on the consulting side, is that thought leadership, owned content is king. There of course is a dislocation in trust in traditional media. We all know that, right? But the internal audience is one of my most favorite things to talk about because it's often, I think, neglected, particularly as it relates to when people think about rolling out material announcements. So if your business is doing a pivot of any kind, or say it's something like an M&A transaction or a large scale restructuring or anything like that, I've always experienced that CEOs think outward first before inward. And when I joined Ariel, one of the first things I did was consolidate what were previously 6 to 7 groups into one. So marketing, communications, public affairs, government affairs, events, philanthropy. I'm sure the number vacillates. I can't remember what, but the one thing that was left out that did not have a practice area was employee communications. HR was kind of doing it, but there was no newsletter to speak of. There was no infrastructure in place. And that was what we built when I joined. And the feedback that we've gotten since we decided to prioritize employees when we roll anything out has been really extraordinary. So there are a few things we've done, I know that we're talking very big level, but I think it would be nice to actually just give some tangible tools for folks on the phone. A few things we did during the pandemic was we bumped up our all staff meetings. So that's easy because we have 123 employees. That's very tiny compared to some of these other institutions. But with webinars and all kinds of things, you can do these more frequently. So we meet, we committed during the pandemic to meet every single month, all staff. And then now we are quarterly. So we have promised to give a readout from every single board meeting to all of our employees so that they know what was talked about, what may or may not change. That has made a huge difference. We send in a recording as well as a written summary after every meeting for those who couldn't make it. We also have a newsletter, which includes sort of a myriad of things. It's things that are happening at the company and benefits and resources, but then also press you may have missed. A lot of employees are actually not involved in the communications framework. So they don't know even that their CEO may have written something in the Wall Street Journal. People forget to share those external earned media hits internally and say, this is the conversation we're having with our stakeholders. This is what we're pushing. This is our agenda. So we have a spotlight on, it's called In Case You Missed It. And it has all of the press and speaking engagements and things where our leaders were out in the market, just to bring the outside in. And then we also do an employee spotlight. So, you'd be surprised, even a staff of 123, there are people that folks have never met. And so we always spotlight someone, we ask them a few questions, but these touch points really, really matter. And we've seen an uptick in employee engagement because we do a survey very frequently. And, since we started some of these initiatives, people feel a lot more connected to the company than they did previously. So I say this all to say, never forget about employee communications. And I would also say words matter. So we stopped using the term employees. We don't call them employees. We call them teammates. If I see the word employee in an email, I lose it. People hear from me. Same thing with like Starbucks. They call their employees partners. Think of ways as a communicator that you can actually up-level the conversation around what your individual contributors mean to you. And sometimes it's just really in what you call them. So that was another little tidbit at the end, but hope that helps.
Trity, I'm curious to know if you have any tips on how to engage team members.
Sure. Hi, Eleanor. I loved what Ariel said about, in case you missed it, we do a similar thing where we pull in not only various announcements, but also perspectives from our employees as well as perspectives from our grantees to get engagement on the diversity of views on a particular topic. Yeah, Eleanor, I've missed the question. What was the question you wanted me to?
Well, that actually was very, very helpful, because you both have brought up, how you are sharing media hits internally. And again, my yes, but is that, the Edelman report shows that media isn't trusted. So are you rethinking your communication strategy? Do you need us? Do you need the media?
So just on that point, I mean, what we actually found is that media, it's polarized. So Dems actually trust media, Republicans don't. So it really depends on sort of where you sit in the country, and frankly, what political affiliation you're with as to whether you trust traditional media or you don't. So I think blanket statement, people don't trust journalists, is not entirely accurate. It's very polarized as well.
That's good for me to hear as a member of the media. But I am curious about just the way that the media landscape is shifting. How are you thinking about that? Say you have a client who's based in a red state. Are you focused on local media over national media? How does trust come into play with your media relations efforts?
It's a great question. I really don't think it's about communicating internally versus communicating to reporters. I think it's 360. So you need to think about, okay, what is my strategy for the media? And specifically, if it is going to be in a topic that is more polarized, what's my strategy for media that might be more in the middle of the country versus on the coasts? In the same way, you'd have to think about, okay, what's my, again, I've worked mostly in the technology industry. What's my strategy for sort of trade press versus more top tier press? You have to sort of think that way as well around sort of polarization. Then you also need to think about, okay, what's my strategy for communicating to my employees, whether it's leveraging internal newsletters, whether it's a webinar with the CEO, whether it's town halls, that employees can be your best advocates. What's my way to leverage new influencers, whether it's creators on TikTok or whether it's people who are sort of key stakeholders who are heads of NGOs or who are academics who can be sort of third-party validators for me. So it's really about thinking about the entire communications landscape rather than just sort of saying, okay, we're going to do an exclusive with the reporter and then we're going to issue our press release and we're done. So it's become a lot more complicated, but it doesn't mean you can ignore any group over another.
I think Margot's exactly right. I tend to be a very old school millennial. So no matter what we do, I always think about what the media angle is. So how we can make lemonade.
I do too.
But I will say that we focus on the audience, who is reading what. So for example, recently PBS came to us about something that we're working on that has a pretty specific audience. And even though PBS has millions and millions of viewers, I know exactly who our audience is. They are not watching that show on PBS. They're just not. Mm-hmm. And so we said no, because it just wasn't hitting that core stakeholder that we want to give us money. So you really just have to think about where you want to move the needle and what your business objectives are. I think a lot of communicators think about the communication strategy first and how to make a splash before they think about the business priorities. That has to follow. You have to start with the business priorities. So are we raising a fund? Are we trying to bring in, portfolio companies? Are we looking to get, whatever it is? Then from there, you determine what the media forum might be, not just the biggest splash or something that looks nice or something that you'd want to print out for your grandmother.
I want to ask one more question before we open it up to the viewers. So Margot, you touched on this during your presentation about global trust, and it still is, such a badge of honor to be such a global company. But you point out that trust varies across the globe, and trust at home doesn't necessarily equal trust abroad. And I feel like tech companies are particularly vulnerable to this trust gap. So can you talk about that?
It's true, and actually we have some additional data points on that. We did a deep dive on trust in tech that we came out with in the fall. And I think some really interesting data points there is when we actually dug into why people don't trust tech companies headquartered in foreign markets It wasn't because of product. It wasn't because they're worried about product issues or the product not working. It was because they were worried about data privacy and security. They were worried about IP. So it was much more about sort of data and intellectual property versus I'm going to buy a product and it's not going to work. So I just thought that was sort of an interesting sort of additional color on it. I mean, all you need to do is just read the news today to understand the world sort of isn't where it was 10 years ago. You have there's the war in the Ukraine. There's increasing tensions through the United States versus China. In a lot of ways, companies seem to have to choose whether they're going to have a China strategy or a US strategy, but you can't necessarily have both. And so I think that makes it just even harder to have sort of a global message. And in many ways, I don't necessarily think companies anymore can have a global message. I think you need to have sort of a message that's localized to the country that you're operating in, or within some countries like the US might even need to be localized within the specific geography within the US that you're looking at. So again, it just becomes that much more complicated for us communications professionals, maybe than it was 10, 15 years ago in sort of the era of globalization.
Thank you. I'm going to jump into some of the questions that have been asked in the chat. Guy is asking, is the world in fact more divided today than it is in the past? Is this a long-term trend? I know, what is this, the 20-somethingth year of the trust survey?
23rd.
23rd. So what is the long-term trend? What have you seen over these 23 years?
That's a great question. I mean, listen, I wish I could have a crystal ball and tell you the future because I'd be very rich. I'd just put all my money into the stock market. But listen, it does seem like the world has become more distrusting. This is particularly true, I think, in developed markets. Also, that mass class divide is something that's only become has only increased over time. So again, sort of the rising income inequality really around the world has resulted in greater trust in institutions among those who are wealthy and much less among those who are not. We do see sort of there is sort of a schism between East and West. For example, the data points around sort of not trusting companies headquartered in foreign markets. So I think those are trends we've seen accelerating. Although over time, if you look in business, for example, different sectors have been trusted or not trusted. That really reflects what's going on in the economy. So for example, if you looked at after the 2008 financial crisis, financial services, and Oscar can speak to this directly, had a massive crash and has really had to rebuild over the last decade plus. Whereas if you look at the technology sector, for example, there used to be a halo of trust around the tech sector. It was your phone, it was your computer. And then increasingly, technology became known as social media, or became known for displacing your jobs, and there became sort of more of a fear and distrust around the technology sector. Health, for example, had a huge bump during the pandemic, and then now has gone down. So a lot of the data, I think, sort of tracks what's going on in the world. But again, it's just sort of interesting to see, numbers around it versus just sort of a feeling you might have.
And we have another disruptor. Sorry to cut you off, Oscar, but maybe you can weigh in on this one. It's a question from Helene in the chat, which is, what are your predictions for what AI can and will do to trust? Any thoughts?
Well, I'm now a chat GPT answering you right now. No, but who knows? Maybe we're going to have a chat GPT webinar in the future. I think Margot called out something very interesting, is that even though we've been living in this relative period over the last couple of years of distrust in some core institutions in society, and certainly things have felt more polarized, things also can change. That dynamic you described between tech and finance, absolutely. I live the finance part. We've all witnessed the swing in fortunes in tech, and we may see even more distrust developing in that part of the global economy, given the geopolitical tensions between us and China, given the fears many have over new technologies like AI. So I think what it means for us as communicators is that we have to be increasingly aware of the cultural currents that are unfolding out there and how they impact perceptions of, institutions, including the companies that we play a role in leading.
And just some additional data points just around going back to AI. What's interesting, again, going back to the survey that we did in the fall, AI is trusted in developing markets, and it's not trusted in developed markets. And that's the same with emerging technologies overall, whether it's blockchain or autonomous vehicles. In the developing world, there's high levels of trust. In the developed world, there's not. So again, it's sort of an interesting schism there, where again, if you're in the communications industry and you need to communicate about AI, just sort of know that there's differences between the two.
Yeah, one of our values at the agency is the courage to be curious. And I think we as communications professionals have to be even more curious than ever about all the things going on in our society today, if we're going to be the counselors that we aspire to be to our clients.
A question from Larry in the Q&A section is, any thoughts on how government can restore trust? I know.
Listen, I think it's not unlike how the most trusted companies earn trust. You just have to deliver the goods. You have to say what you promise. You have to act, and you have to execute well. And I think what has built up over recent years is this sense that government sometimes can't shoot straight, or is inefficient, or doesn't deliver through on the promises it makes. And you've had this pent up sentiment over time. Now get almost, extrapolated to a whole other level through the underlying polarized nature of our political discourse. So I think if we could, maybe reintroduce the word compromise again as one that is actually good for our society, and government can deliver on things that stakeholders and citizens want, maybe that's the beginning.
Yeah, I think I completely agree. And I also think an increase in public-private partnerships would be useful, right? So the study actually showed that people trust private institutions more. So maybe governments could capitalize on that. Part of my remit also includes government affairs at my firm. And so, just a quick stat, in the past 2 years, we've done about 150 to 200 meetings with elected officials on the Hill, just to not only discuss our concerns and what we're focused on, but actually to bring actionable strategic ideas. And I think a more receptive community on the Hill would be really useful, because I don't think that governments can do it alone. And I also don't think that corporations can do it alone. So I think just more acknowledgement of that, the need for those partnerships would help everybody. And I think bolster trust with individuals who clearly trust, the brands that they've put their lives in the hands of.
On the same topic of partnership. Sorry, go ahead.
I was just going to add that I'm actually in DC right now for a civic science convening, and also the American Association for the Advancement of Science, where we're partnering scientists with policymakers to give them that insight, both the scientists' insight from what are the conditions under which policymakers are operating, and also the policymakers some of the insider view of what the science is, and helping those who are interested to be boundary spanners, scientists who want to have one leg in the realm of making a difference in the bigger picture, helping them have more opportunities. I think it's going to be helpful to all.
So along those lines of partnership, Sharon wants to know, NGOs are seen as a trusted source of info. Oh, no, I'm sorry. She said, can you pinpoint the types of issues that would be ideal for businesses to work with NGOs on? Ariel, you're shaking your head.
Well, I only have one right now, but it's such a hot button issue, which is the racial wealth disparity. Again, corporations are the employers, the number one employers of people who are aiming to secure financial security for their families. And so all the wonderful initiatives that folks on the Hill try to roll out cannot be done without institutional cooperation. And so I'd love to see NGOs partner with institutions more to get those ideas to the places they need to be, and also force some action from corporations. And then, so racial wealth disparity, number one, and I think number two would be environmental issues. I mean, same place where I think institutions are the ones that are responsible for most of the negative impact on our earth. And, you can focus on individual households as much as you want, but really it's behemoths that are responsible for the carbon footprint. So I think those are the two areas where I'd love to see as many public-private partnerships as possible.
From the chat, Dr. Karen Lindsay has asked, what trends have you seen along age demographics? Is that something that the report looks into?
It definitely does. I'm just trying to remember back. I know we have a few slides on it. I would definitely have to pull the data, but I know, for example, for Gen Z, issues like climate, issues like, for example, income inequality. These are all things that Gen Z cares deeply about, and they are very, very much oriented around purpose. And they're much more likely to work for a company that has purpose. They're much more likely to buy from a brand that has purpose, and they deeply care about issues like climate. So Gen Z, purpose is huge for them. It's a really major factor in buying decisions and employment decisions.
And when it comes down to their expectations, they have the highest expectations. They expect the most action, and they are also the generation most likely to be influenced from a consumer behavior standpoint with respect to how they perceive whether or not institutions or companies or brands are living up to some of the societal challenges we're facing.
All right, we're starting to almost get to time. So I'd love to just wrap up with all of you. If you could have the people watching have one takeaway, what is your one takeaway that you want them to leave here with? I'll start with you, Trity.
Stay curious, ask questions, be a scientist, be comfortable with uncertainty, but be clear in your communication.
Margot?
I think the key takeaway is really that business has the license to lead, and that for all of us who are, CCOs at companies or advising clients, I think it's important for people to, encourage businesses to lead. At Edelman, we've come up with something called action communications. It's not just about talking about things, it's about doing things. And we really believe in that. And I think the data shows, why that's so important.
Oscar, I'll pivot it over to you.
I think in addition to those points, meet stakeholders where they are. Treat them, understand them in a way that reflects your ongoing invested understanding of where they're coming from. And that is really important.
All right. And Arielle, to close us off, any key takeaways?
Sure. I think at many institutions, communicators are siloed and not given a seat at the table. So I happen to be lucky to be at an institution that supports what I do and to be able to sit on the operating committee. But for those who do not, remember that your natural response can be, I don't have a messaging solution for this. What are we going to do? Then I'm happy to message it. Try to push that because I think more and more I'm seeing communicators just put into these little boxes where they are meant to put lipstick on pigs or whatever the idiom is. I'm forgetting what it is now. And it's really up to you to say, actually, a corrective action or some sort of new initiative is really within my remit as a communicator. That is something, that's a story to tell, not just repurposing what you've already decided. So, push that door down, break it down.
Okay, push the door down and break it down. Great advice to wrap it up. So I wanted to thank Eleanor. Thank you for being such a fantastic moderator. Really appreciate it. And thank you to Margot for presenting the data, and to our wonderful panelists, Arielle, Oscar, and Trity. We really appreciate you being here today and taking the time for us. And thanks to Edelman for partnering on this webinar. And thanks to the IPR team for running fantastic webinars as usual.
Yes.
So appreciate each and every one of you for joining us today and for asking such really great questions. We hope you enjoyed it and found it valuable. Clearly, we have a lot of work to do. The playback will be available on our website and YouTube channel within 48 hours. So hope you all have a nice day, morning, evening, wherever you are based. Thank you all.
Thank you, Tina.